First of all, when you look at the economy, when you look at the kind of lockdown that we're seeing and the recovery, how do you see this playing out? What will the UK economy look like in 2 years?
Well, I think we're going into a period where the world economy as a whole is going to look quite different, and including the UK. Trade is going to change. I think everyone is talking about de-risking supply chains and making supply chains much more local. That's partly a response to the crisis of coronavirus, but it's also a response to automation, which is making it cheaper for firms to reshore business back to higher wage economies. And it's also a way to protect yourself from trade wars. We're also going to have an economy that's much more digital. We've seen the boom in digital during this crisis, and a lot of that is going to stick, and we're going to see a lot more domestic and international trade in services going digital. We're also going to be in a world of very low interest rates for a very, very long time. Countries, all governments, the UK and all governments have borrowed a huge amount, and people will be worried about deflation because of what's happening on the supply side. So interest rates are going to be low. And then I think finally we're going to be in a world in which demand for social insurance is going to go up. I think this crisis has revealed that many, many people in our economies have no savings and no employment protection and no safety net supporting them. And the demand for that will grow, and there will be a backlash against the sort of extreme flexibility that has occurred in our labour markets. That will require taxes to rise to pay for that social insurance.
How much, I mean, you talk about social insurance, how much more support will households actually need once the economy starts to recover? So it seems that a lot is being now thrown at dealing with the crisis. Once the lockdown ends and the recovery starts, to make sure that we have real growth, what kind of measures will we need?
Well, I think the immediate measures of kind of keeping the economy in hibernation until lockdown ends will have to be phased out. A lot will depend on the nature of the phase out. I think everyone expects that it won't be reversion back to normal, and so the lockdown will be phased out, and I think the economic return to normalcy will be equally phased.
When you talk about inequality, what kind of inequality will the pandemic be revealing, and what would be the right way then to address this?
Well, the most extreme inequality is obviously between rich and poor countries. And I think one of the tragedies of the current response to the crisis is that national governments have thrown the kitchen sink at the crisis, but there's been far too inadequate an international response, particularly focused on the poorest countries where the coronavirus has only just begun to play out. And if we don't prevent it from being a catastrophe there, we'll never solve what is really a global pandemic. And I think that is where the worst inequality is. Of course, within countries, we've seen inequality, particularly and most acutely for those workers who are working flexibly, workers who are part-time, gig workers, 0 hours. Those are the people who have suffered the most and for whom a lack of safety net has been most apparent.
Minouche, Shafik, when do you think we'll get to, is this going to be a new normal, or when will we, go back to the kind of growth in the economy that we've had in the past? Will it take 5 years, 10 years? Do we really understand also the unintended consequences of this huge crisis?
Yeah. I think what's different about this crisis is usually when you have an exogenous shock, say like an earthquake or a supply shock in the oil market, you have a bit of a boom afterwards. Even tragically, after a war, you often see sharp drop in GDP, and then there's a recovery period and a need to rebuild, and that creates economic activity. I think what's different about this crisis is that we're having a big structural change in our economies to things like people's willingness to travel, to people's preferences for operating digitally. And so the recovery will not be a simple bounce back to what it was like before. it will be a recovery which includes this structural change, which I think will take more time to generate growth in economic activity.
What's it like being ahead of one of the most well-known universities, Minouche? How is that going? I don't know if everyone's on online courses and when you actually expect physical courses to restart.
It's a huge challenge. I mean, we were one of the first universities to shift online. I have to say, I am amazed at how everyone, both faculty and students, have risen to the challenge of operating virtually for the remainder of the academic year. We are looking at what happens at the beginning of next academic year. I think particularly uncertainty about how many students will come, and particularly international students, which are very important for many UK universities. We're preparing as a contingency to continue online if we have to. We're also thinking about how social distancing can operate on a campus. And also, importantly, we're doing our bit to support the recovery. So LSE economists just this week published a very interesting analysis on when the lockdown should end, using a well-being framework and asking what are the costs and benefits for human well-being of the lockdown, and concluded that in the UK, for example, the lockdown should end on around June 1st. LSE faculty our anthropologists have done some great work on funerary practices and how people are coping with death and tragedy, and supporting the government in adjusting its policies on how it copes with issues around deaths and sadness around coronavirus. And also, importantly, studying across a whole array of issues of how different households, particularly vulnerable households and elderly households, are coping with this crisis, and how we could do a better job of looking after them during this time.